Hi everybody and welcome to today's video where we are looking at Act 5 Scene 2 of Othello, and we've only got a couple of videos left on this course, so I just want to say thank you for watching it so far, and I hope that it's helped you in terms of your analysis of the play. So in terms of where we are with the plot, well, in the previous scene represented by the sword, we saw that Rodrigo and Iago attacked Cassio. Cassio was wounded, but he survived. Rodrigo, however, has been killed by Iago. And so there are aspects of Iago's plan that have gone well, but aspects that haven't gone well. So Cassio isn't supposed to be alive at this point. Now, as soon as Othello has heard the commotion, he's taken that as the signal to go and murder Desdemona. And at the start of this scene, he enters the bedchamber and speaks a soliloquy over the sleeping Desdemona, which I've represented by the candle here, and you'll see why in a minute. And he prepares to kill his wife. So the big question that we're going to look at today is, how does Shakespeare present Othello's descent into violence? Because a little bit like Hamlet, Othello does agonise over the murder of his wife, certainly at this point of the play. Now, before we delve into the language of the scene, I want us to think about the staging of it first, because remember, when we're talking about writers' methods and we're talking about a play, the staging is just as important as the vocabulary and the linguistic choices that the writer has made. So the first thing to notice is that the setting for this scene is a private bedchamber. Now, that might not be significant in your mind, given that we're talking about a romance here and a marriage between Othello and Desdemona. However, it is significant because generally we've seen them in public together. So in Act 1, Scene 3, for example, we see them in the Sagittary talking to the senators, declaring their love in a very public sphere. At the start of Act 2, Scene 1, we see them at the docks of Cyprus, Othello having just arrived from his long voyage, and again they passionately declare their love in public. At the middle of Act 4, Othello strikes Desdemona, again in public. So we haven't seen many private scenes between them. And what we have seen, though, is a very intimate scene between Othello and Iago, where they're in private and Iago kneels down to pledge his loyalty to Othello. And we've seen a very private scene between Desdemona and Emilia in Act 4, Scene 3, in the bedchamber, where they both share their concerns and their worries, and Emilia shares her ideas about femininity. So I suppose what we have seen is that friendship in the play can be a lot stronger than romantic relationships. And now we have this very private, intimate scene between Othello and Desdemona, but it's perverted, it's twisted, because it's a murder scene, not a love scene. So I suppose the setting reminds us just how far the characters have come from what their relationship should have been. And that relationship should have been a celebration of challenging the racist preconceptions of society, challenging the dependence of society on social hierarchies, and also challenging the idea that in a patriarchal society, women should be subservient to men. Because initially, this marriage symbolised a black person being able to marry a white person and overcoming those racial boundaries, symbolised an older person marrying a younger person. It showed how a woman could have equality with her husband and be able to articulate her own feelings. So the marriage should have been a celebration of social progress. But actually we see this very twisted, very perverted, very corrupted relationship in the bedchamber in this scene. And that, of course, is reflected in the darkness of the scene. So we've moved from the kind of light, bright setting of the docks of Cyprus at the start of Act 2, Scene 1, into this darkness. And the play is bookended by darkness as well. So Act 1, Scene 1, for example, where Shakespeare establishes the racism of Venetian society, is set in darkness. And now we see the darkness as well here, because that racism has corrupted, it's infiltrated the relationship, and so Shakespeare's showing the impact of social problems on the relationships between individuals and how racism can destroy individual lives. The darkness, of course, also shows the immorality that Othello is experiencing at this point, and also the power that Iago, because Iago is associated with darkness, the power that Iago is holding over the other characters. We see Othello holding a light as well in this scene, and of course in the previous scene, Act 5 Scene 1, it's Iago who enters the scene with a light, so we have an echo between Iago's actions and Othello's actions here, and we see just how much of a copy of Iago Othello has become. And the light should represent holiness, goodness, heavenliness, positivity, but actually again this is something that Iago has twisted and corrupted. You know, everything that is good in the world Iago takes and he perverts it, so we see that with the light here. Another aspect of the staging that's important is the presence of Desdemona. So she's lying in the marriage bed on the wedding sheets, which we discussed quite a lot in the previous videos. So we have her very innocent, very compliant, waiting for her husband, loyally trusting that he is going to come back and he's going to be in love with her still. Desdemona is also asleep, which reflects her vulnerability at the hands of this violent man, but as well as that, it reflects the bigger sense of the vulnerability of women in a patriarchal society. It also shows us how trusting Desdemona is of her husband. You know, she's been aware in Act 4, Scene 3 that she's probably going to die that night and she's probably going to be murdered by her husband, whereas here she's asleep, which doesn't seem to be a very sensible thing to do if you're worried about being murdered. You know, you'd stay awake to try and protect yourself. But Desdemona is totally trusting of Othello, and her love is so self-sacrificing that she is prepared to be murdered if that's what Othello wants to do. Now, I suppose that is quite an unsettling idea for us as an audience, and we see the impact that manipulation, gaslighting, domestic abuse can have on an individual woman. We also have a great deal of pathos for the tragic victim here, and Shakespeare's really emphasising Desdemona's innocence, and in doing so throwing into relief, highlighting Othello's evil at this point of the play, and the how Iago's malevolence is spreading throughout the play. We see a great juxtaposition as well with the previous scene, which was all chaos, movement, different voices, different people talking over one another, everyone quite unsure what's happening. So we have a bit of a shift between these two scenes as well. So Othello comes on with the light and he goes over to the bed where Desdemona is sleeping, and then he speaks his soliloquy. And he starts off almost halfway through a thought. He says, it is the cause, my soul. So he's using a euphemism here, I suppose, saying, you know, the cause, well, what he means is my belief in Desdemona's infidelity is going to lead me to murder her. So he's catching all of those ideas up in this word, the cause. And then it's interesting that he appeals to his soul here. And we've talked about the word soul a lot in these videos, so I'm sorry that I'm talking about it again, but it is important. So the soul is something which is really the kernel of your being, where your whole identity is encapsulated, and the soul would continue on beyond death, at least in the belief of the Renaissance audience, or much of the Renaissance audience. So your soul would go to eternal heaven or eternal damnation. And Othello has previously talked about the soul in very transcendental terms, you know, oh my soul. He's just transported into a sense of heavenliness by his love for Desdemona, whereas later on Iago, as he does with everything that's good, takes the word soul and twists it and perverts it, and then Othello has picked that up here as well. So I suppose what we see is Iago's negative influence over everything that should be good, but also the profundity of Othello's belief that he is doing the right thing here. And then he says, I'll not shed her blood, nor scar that whiter skin of hers than snow, and smooth as monumental alabaster. So he doesn't want to spoil Desdemona's body by leaving a physical sign of his violence. What he wants to do is to make her perfect. He's looking at her now, thinking about how evil and corrupt he believes that she is, and he wants to transform her into the woman of his dreams, the woman that he's imagining. And the imagery here reveals what that imagining is. So the idea of snow is something that's quite resonant in literature. So snow is very cold, it's very static, it's very, I suppose, emotionally cold, but at the same time it's unchanging and it's frozen in time and space. So what Othello wants is to create a woman who doesn't change, a woman who doesn't develop. And so we have this conflict between the patriarchal idea of women being static objects and the reality that actually women, just like men, as Amelia articulated at the end of Act 4, Scene 3, women do change, and women do have emotions, and women will have real life human relationships with other people. And that's what Othello's objecting to here. He wants to petrify her, to turn her into stone, to turn her into something that's not going to change. And then he describes her using another similar imagery. He wants her to be as smooth as monumental alabaster. So he wants to turn her into a statue, essentially, that he can worship. And again, alabaster is something that would be unchanging, that would be static, that would be perfect forever. So again, we have this idea of how Othello objects to the reality of Desdemona's existence, and he wants to make her perfect so that she can be his forever. So it's this idea of complete and utter possession as well. And then he says, yet she must die or else she'll betray more men. So he's envisioning Desdemona as someone who's not just had one affair with Cassio, which he believes, but someone who's going to go on to have a string of affairs, who's going to become even more corrupt, even more immoral. And then he says, put out the light, and then put out the light. So obviously he's got a light in his hand, which he might put out at this point, but he's also talking about putting out the light of life. So put out the light that I'm holding, and then put out Desdemona's light. And he looks at the candle that he's holding and says, if I quench thee, so if I put you out, thy flaming minister, I can again thy former light restore, should I repent me. So if he puts out his torch or his candle, he can relight it again. So he can just get a match and light it again. But once put out thy light, so here he turns to Desdemona, once I put out thy light, thy cunning's pattern of excelling nature, I know not where is that Promethean heat that can thy light relume. So relume means to light again. So if he puts out Desdemona's light, he cannot light her again. He cannot bring her back to life. And notice the hyperbolic language that he's using here. The Promethean heat is a classical allusion to a classical figure who brought light down from the sun to give to humanity. So Othello is understanding his actions in, I suppose, very hyperbolic terms. He's seeing his actions as kind of cosmically necessary here, whereas actually maybe what the audience see is a domestic argument that's leading to a very specific murder. And then Othello says, when I have plucked the rose, I cannot give it vital growth again. So this is the same kind of image. Once he's plucked something that's living, once he's destroyed something that's living, he cannot bring it back to life. And look at the understated violence in the word plucked there. So we've got the plosive of the P sound at the start, and we have this sense that something is going to be destroyed there. He uses the word rose, which is of course a romantic symbol, but as with everything in this scene, things that are supposed to be romantic and good are twisted and turned into images of death and destruction. And he says that this rose is going to wither. So Othello is reflecting here on the nature of death and the nature of murder, and the fact that life does have an end point and that you cannot restore it again. And then he leans over Desdemona's body and he says, "Oh, balmy breath, that almost does persuade justice to break her sword." So he's reflecting on how beautiful his wife is at this moment. Now, as an audience, we are watching a physically strong, powerful man leaning over his sleeping wife with the intent to kill her. So this is an awful moment as the audience, but it's also a moment where Othello might change his mind. In tragedy, we have this conflict, this tension between the inevitability of downfall and the feeling that something might stop that downfall from happening. So in Macbeth, for example, we have, before he murders King Duncan, we have moments where he thinks, actually, I might not do this. I might not go through with it. But then he does go through with it. And we know that he's going to because the witches have predicted that. Here, all the way through the play, we have the sense that if they just have a conversation about what's happening, then this death, this downfall might not happen. And we've seen that Cassio and Bianca have been able to have a conversation about the handkerchief and move through that. And maybe Othello and Desdemona can do the same thing. And here, maybe Othello's infatuation, his love, his passion for Desdemona can overcome his loyalty to Iago. It almost persuades justice to break her sword. And the poignancy of that word almost is just, it's so potent at this point. And then this idea of justice breaking her sword is really interesting, because Othello sees his murder of Desdemona as being just, as being right, as being something that would be legal almost, and he's using this very legalistic language. So he sees himself as being fully justified in this action. Of course, as an audience, what we're watching is the head of state, the person who is supposed to enforce the law, committing a murder. You know, if you were going to really give justice to someone, they should be tried, it should be discussed, it should be spoken about in public, but that's not what's happening here. And then he says, I will kill thee and love thee after. So we're going back to this idea of the snow and the alabaster. He's going to kill her, and in killing her, he will make her perfect, because she will not be able to change. She will not be able to love someone else or have an affair again. And when she's perfect and unchanging, then he's going to love her. So for your independent learning, what I want you to think about is the symbolism of this speech. So reflect on what I've said already and think about what you know about the play, where else we see these symbols appearing in the play, and your wider knowledge of English literature in general, and where you've come across these symbols previously. And I want you to see how many interpretations or connotations that you can come up with for each of the images that Othello uses in his soliloquy. So have a go at that, and we will look at the actual murder in the next stage, in the next video.